Introducing the first panel of the day. So we have a group of Docker alumni, I could say, that I think kind of among the group, we have decades of experience in cloud development, and we're quite interested to watch their conversation here. And they will cover the past and future of developer experience. So where do we come from? How has this all started? What was your view in the past? Where are we going? Of course, with a special focus on container technology, but also going beyond that. And we have Chad, who is building our self-hosted business at Gitpod. We have Andrea, who's co-founder at Dagger. We have Arnaud, founder of Echoes HQ, and Ben, founder of Replicate. Really an impressive round. And I would say, let's bring them onto the stage, and I will make space. Looking forward to this panel.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Michael. It's great to see you all. I have not seen many of you in a long time. We'll just start with some deeper intros. I'm Chad Metcalf. I was at Docker for 6 years. And the first half, I did some sales stuff. And in the second half, I focused a lot on developer experience as it relates to like the big cloud partnerships that Docker had. So making a better together story with Amazon and Microsoft and the clouds and also VS Code. And now I'm at Gitpod. Let's go around the horn, starting, we'll start with Arnaud, go to Andrea, and then wrap with Ben. And I'd love to understand like a little bit of what you did. We're just 4 people that worked at Docker. There's nothing particularly special about the 4 of us. It's just 4 fun people in a room. So let's go.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Arnaud. I worked at Docker between 2014 and 2018. I was a maintainer of the open source project, and I was the manager in charge of the engine team, which was the team in charge of everything which lived under the github.com Docker/Docker repo. So Docker CLI, Docker daemon, and the hundreds of contributions we were receiving from the community on a weekly basis. And today I'm the founder of a company called Echoes HQ. And yeah, Andrea, go for it.
Yeah, glad to see you all. It's been a while. So I'm Andrea. I joined Docker back in 2011 when it was still called .cloud. So I was there during the transition from being a platform as a service back to an open source project. And then at that point, I worked on a bunch of different projects, including Docker itself, Swarm, different incantation of Swarm, and then other internal stuff. And today, I'm the co-founder of Dagger. And back to you, Ben.
Hi, everyone. It's very nice to see you all. At Docker, I worked on a few things. I worked in engineering on Compose and Machine. And then worked on product as well. So talking to customers, figuring out what they wanted and all that kind of thing. And now I'm starting another company, which is where we're building developer tools for machine learning people, which is another whole bit of software. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, there might have been some selection to make sure we had some engine, some Swarm, and some Compose view for a developer experience. So I put together this panel, and one of the things was a very selfish question, which was that even though I had been at Docker for a long time, I never really knew the backstory of Compose and how Compose came to be. So Ben and everyone else can jump in because I think everyone was around, but I think this one might be a good place to start with. Ben, can you tell us a little bit about the history of at least one of my favorite Docker tools?
Yeah, sure. It's sort of a roundabout one, so I'm trying to kind of compress it in my mind. But it started as a separate company. Funnily, Actually, what Andrea mentioned is that Docker used to be a company called .cloud, where it was a platform as a service. Funnily, I was also building a competitor to .cloud called Epio. That's how I got to First Know Solomon. And the problem we were trying to solve, which was a very kind of, I suppose, topical developer-facing problem, is that we used Heroku, and Heroku was fantastic. If you're just a developer and you want to get your application running. But as soon as you want to do something kind of custom, like, oh, I need to store some files on disk, or I need to have a service that's not publicly accessible to the web, or something along those lines, you have to fall all the way down to blank EC2 servers and build your way back up again. And it was just, hire a DevOps team, basically, or an infrastructure team, as it was called then. And so we set about trying to build a platform as a service to solve this. And it was very similar to .cloud. So we had these kind of high-level concepts that were a service, which was some kind of thing that could scale up and down. We had load balancers, we had volumes, we had networks, and all these kind of high-level constructs all defined in this YAML file that was the kind of precursor to what Compose was. And we pursued this for a while, as a lot of platforms did. We invented a kind of internal version of Docker as well. We called them very small virtual machines. And then Docker came along, and we realized, oh, this is the thing. Like this, we can't compete with this. This is just the right abstraction for this kind of this low-level container thing. So we then pivoted to building tools on top of Docker. So we took those abstractions that we created for Epio and built them on top of Docker in the form of Compose. And that was the start of it, basically. And I think there's a couple of interesting lessons in there where one thing is instead of trying to build something for production, we shifted all the way to development because we realized that was a much easier kind of starting point for people. There's a lot fewer constraints. It doesn't matter if it goes down and all this kind of thing. So it's much easier for people to pick it up and use it. And one thing we tried really hard to do, which we then, I think, carried on at Docker, which was really nice, is always building around a particular user and a particular workflow. So we always thought when designing this product, there's a person sitting there with a web and database application, and they need to get that running. And that's like the lowest possible, that's the thing we're building around. And that's where Compose Up came from. It's where Compose Run came from, and all these kind of shorthands for doing in that workflow. Yeah, that's the short story.
Yeah. I think that workflow bit was really important. It was one of the things that I talked a lot about when I was trying to get Compose support into the other places was, for a developer, A talks to B and B talks to C, and C just happens to be a database. But I just want to tie those things together and then just have them. And I don't want to necessarily do a lot. I think that's a really great, I think, for Andrea or Arnaud, what was your sort of view in on that workflow bit? Because I think that was pretty common across all of the tools is that, who's the user and what are the things they actually need to do their job.
Do you want to go? Can I?
Yeah, go for it.
No, but I think it's super interesting. The story of Compose is interesting because when you look at it, Docker already had massive success by itself just with the ability to do Docker run Redis. And that was already like a significant improvement to developer experience all around. And yet there was still so much adoption, so many users, and so much need for something like Docker that it still opened up a wide area for improvement that Compose managed to fill on the developer experience side. And as you were saying, Chad, there were many workflows, there were many kind of users. One of the biggest challenges we had with the engine is that it was not about the developers only. It was somewhere in this gray area where it's being used for developers locally on the laptop, by ops in production on the server, and trying to please everyone was extremely complicated. We can also add another layer with platforms integrating engine as a building block. So for example, Kubernetes, of course. But each of those areas, they had they had a huge greenfield of tools we could build to improve on the workflow or the experience of one specific vertical and one specific user, which I think is pretty fascinating. And I don't know if that's something we can attribute to the very fast adoption of Docker and the very rapid success of Docker, or just the intensity of the need that it was actually fulfilling.
Yeah, and to add to that, to add some, even going a little bit further back, I think it was quite some time ago. It was like 9 years ago now when Docker was first introduced, and I don't think we were talking about DX back then. It was just user experience, not developer experience. And one interesting bit is that Docker didn't really bring invent containers. Like all that stuff was already existing. Like you had C groups, you had namespaces, you had overlay file system. Like all that stuff was existing, and there were already tools to make that available. But their DX was terrible, and no one was actually using containers except like a few platform as a service companies like Heroku or DocCloud or Ben's company. And so I think that's actually the main thing that introduced Docker was actually the developer experience, and that's where it clicked for everyone. Where we took images for containers, and then we took like C groups, namespaces, overlay file system, and kind of slapped a DX on top, and with like a very simple like Docker run command that would pull an image, start a container, set up networking, and do all that stuff in milliseconds. And I think that's what actually made a container successful, was the DX. But there was not really like a new underlying technology that wasn't available a year before. It was just about developer experience. So I think that's why it's been part of the culture. Like early on Docker, it was developer experience, just because that was everything. That's what made the project successful, and that's what made Fig, and then which became Compose later on, successful as well.
Yeah, and go ahead.
I was just going to say, funnily, we got hired at Docker. So I made Compose with a friend of mine, Arnaud, who also joined Docker. And we joined Docker just at the time that developer experience was starting to become a thing. And Solomon actually hired us as the developer experience team. That's what he said. We want you to be the developer experience team. But I think it just kind of dissipated, because I think we realized, like you said, Andrea, that Docker was the developer experience team. It's just how we operated. So I'm not sure what happened to that. It just kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I think that pattern kind of stayed like later on. Also, to start Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows, we hired people that came from the gaming industry. That were used to make like nice user interfaces and things like that. So I think, that I think Fig Compose was like the very first dedicated developer experience team, and got brought into the entire company. But then like it kind of continued for new products like Docker for Desktop.
Yeah. And that's a good lead in to sometimes making things really simple is actually really hard. So I think a lot of people don't really understand like how complicated Docker Desktop is and how much it's doing under the hood. And we certainly had a million different kits, so VPN kit and all of the different kits that were there to help out. What do you think the biggest lessons for y'all were in that easy button? So something that is extraordinarily complicated, but comes off looking very easy, which is both success, but can also be a challenge, because when it comes to building a business, sometimes it's hard if folks think it's so easy.
My biggest lesson in there, I think, is Docker for me, and the reason I joined the company in the first place, is it's really this kind of love at first sight of a developer experience that was really delightful to use. Before Docker, when I was thinking about developer tools, I was thinking Git, grep, sed, all those things that are super powerful, but definitely not friendly. And I think Docker managed to strike this balance where it feels powerful, but it remains simple to use. And I think that was a defining factor for the company as a whole. If you remember in the early days, and I think for a couple of years actually, one of the mission statement that was repeated in the keynotes at DockerCon and others were that our mission was to build tools of mass innovation. And I think this is really what it was about, taking the things that were super powerful in the world, but were kind of the niche features and products that only the big companies knew how to use or had the big enough teams to know how to operate, and package this into something that, you know, anybody can use and hopefully build the next billion-dollar company in their garage just being 2 developers. And I think that was really the goal.
Yeah. And I like to add, like, easy is hard. Like for instance, you mentioned like all the kits and Docker for desktop, and the hardest parts of, you know, shipping Docker for desktop, it's stuff that, you know, you don't actually see. Like, there was a tremendous amount of efforts going in just, you know, to be able to seamlessly go through a corporate VPN, like VPN kit. No one sees it, but it's doing crazy stuff like reverse engineering your, you know, Ethernet packets out and trying to, you know, put them back into your macOS stack. And like that was a crazy thing to do. And I think that's why still today, there's no, as far as I know, like there's nothing that comes close to that experience, just because like we put so much effort in stuff that no one can see. And it did create a challenge. I think it's really important to know, you know, who your user is, because, you know, some people, like, for that like great experience, some people call that amazing, and some people call that, you know, black magic. You know, if you have to actually run that stuff in production and there's layers and layers of magic to make it more usable, well, that's something you don't want to, you know, people that actually run production services do not want. They prefer like simple and predictable. And so you really need to know like who you're basically creating your tools for. And that was also an important lesson. We tried to, I think Arnaud mentioned that, we were trying to gather everyone, like, let's try to make everyone happy at once. Realize you cannot do that. Like, you have contradiction in needs. And when you try to make someone happy, you're going to really irritate some other folks.
Yeah. One of the things that I liked that I read, I don't remember when it came out, but Ben, you and I guess Arnaud put together a guide that kind of distilled, at least from the CLI side of things, some of the things that I think at least you pulled out of your time at Docker. Can you talk to us a little bit about that guide and what it was about? And
yeah, sure. It came about because I was trying to make a new CLI for my current company, and just realized there's no kind of up-to-date guidelines about how to build good command line interfaces. So there are some sort of guides from the 1980s. The Unix programming environment comes to mind. But it's all still based around, as the title implies, it's based around this world where command line applications were really a scripting environment. And they're all intended to be these kind of small tools that you kind of piece together into a greater whole to create scripts and things like this, which is still the case. But more often than not, command line interfaces nowadays are being used as user interfaces. So Git really is primarily a user interacting with Git doing things. And Docker is like half-half maybe. You know, sometimes it's integrated into production systems, sometimes it's used by users. But things like Compose, for example, is very much weighted towards it's normally a human interacting with these things. And so some of these old lessons about by default say nothing makes sense when you're writing a shell script. Otherwise, your shell script would just spew out loads of stuff that was meaningless. But when I'm a user interacting with Git, actually that's very unhelpful because I don't understand what's going on and what it's doing, you know. So we wanted to create a kind of updated guide around those kind of things, with some of those updated lessons of like, okay, what if a human is primarily interfacing with these things? It's called the CLI Guidelines, and it's at clig.dev.
yeah, we'll make sure we put the link in the description for the YouTube video. I think that's sort of the same. I think did we have a specific notion of like the porcelain and the pipes like Git does for like what commands are going to be more the porcelain versus what commands are more the pipes? Because there are some things like I want to just go blow away all the images before system prune existed, right? So like there were some things that you would write some scripts for. But did we have that notion, or was there some other sort of thought around how we looked at what parts would be for a user and what part would be for a tool?
Specifically for the case of developers, I wonder if at some point we didn't reach the situation where the Docker CLI was the plumbing and Docker Compose was the porcelain. The struggle with trying to address different populations is that we were in the middle of developers who wanted to run code on their machine, having their dependency solved, et cetera, and the ops who wanted all the knobs. So all the possibilities that C groups and namespaces could offer. And this is why when you type docker run -- help, there's a lot of options, probably more than there should be for developers, but that's the reality now. So yeah, I think at some point Docker Compose became that porcelain experience.
Yeah, actually, I use it because I don't remember, so I just set up all the options once and then never go back. And actually, maybe that's a great time to start looking forward. So containers are here to stay, right? But there's still some challenges. Like there's lots of complexity in the world now, more so than I feel like there was when we started. We took a bunch of complexity out, and then a bunch of complexity showed up. So I'd love to sort of go around, and maybe starting with Andrea, for what do you think the big challenges are to tackle next?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as you said, like the complexity is still here, and maybe even more so. The one problem that we tried to solve with Docker was the very famous, like, hey, it works on my laptop, and then of course, it doesn't work in production anymore, or it doesn't work on your coworker's laptop. But now you have the same stuff. You have containers, so you can package your application. But the rest, there's a ton of glue that's just bespoke shell scripts left and right, and the same stuff is happening now. Like, hey, the tests are passing on my laptop, but then you bring them on CI and they break, or on someone else's laptops they do not work. And the experience, like Docker made the application portable, but then the rest of the tooling, like of the entire supply chain, from like I'm developing on my laptop, I'm running the test, I'm open a pull request, and the tests are running, they're passed, it's merged back, and then some other glue happens to pick up the code at some point, make that into a release, and templatize some other config on the side and push that to a cluster, maybe a multiple clusters. And all that stuff is really custom and bespoke. And so I think that's the main challenge going forward, is like, how do you apply the same principles of reusability and basically isolation, and apply them to the entire chain?
Arnaud or Ben, you want to jump in with some thoughts about what's next?
I mean, I can try. I will answer with my bias, but
100%. Yeah, we're just four people, so we're not right. We'll just be close.
I feel that there's a lot of things that are happening since the arrival of Docker that have made tremendous results in terms of developer productivity. And I think that this area is getting a lot of attention, rightfully so, because of course, software development right now is at the core of most companies. The area that I'm feeling is underserved now is the other aspect of DX, the more global aspect of DX, which is more of the organizational context, like how good it is to be shipping code really, really fast and developing code really, really fast. If you don't have clear priorities, if you don't know what problem you're solving, and ultimately if you're shipping things that are not having any business impact. So for me, this belongs to developer experience, because actually shipping things that matter is part of developer experience, and the context in which you are operating as an engineer is part of developer experience. So I think this is an area that is really underserved, and I hope that this is where we're going to see improvements in the upcoming years. Although, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of things we can continue doing with developer experience and with individual developer productivity. Replicate, Dagger are definitely on top of those. But I think there's going to be a wider definition of developer experience.
Well, I think Michael was talking about this in the beginning. We see a lot of excitement around, backstage, which is workflow related, but it's also more just like understanding like the scope of everything that's out there, right? So,
yeah, and it takes the approach of looking at development as a team sport, basically. So knowing that it's developer experience is not about each individual in front of their laptops. It's also about how team interact, how documentation is discovered, how teams communicate, especially now in a time where basically there's literally no way to ship meaningful things in production without having interactions with the services owned by a different team with this or that open source project or this or that SaaS product. So yeah, this is, I think, absolutely crucial.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting if we think about, if you think about DevXs in terms of like, we all have a lot to do and we would all like to go home to our friends and our families and our hobbies. So then, are there things around us that we can improve that aren't just specifically around the curly braces or shipping bits back and forth? I think it's a way to think about developer experience that's a little bit broader. And one of the things that I think about a lot, so I'm not a traditional computer scientist. I was a biologist before I switched over, is big tents, right? So there's a lot of folks that write code nowadays that might not label themselves software developers. And I think that was one of the great things that Docker did, because I wouldn't necessarily have to know how to start Redis, but I might need to use it. I could just Docker run Redis and have it up and not have to know. Maybe I could learn it later, but just to get started, just to type a curly brace, just to get my job going, I didn't have to know that. I think that was a great democratization step. Certainly that's part of why I joined Gitpod. So very similar, like make it easy, let folks focus on the one challenge. But there's a lot of folks. So, Ben, I think you're one of the people who've taken the furthest step from sort of the way that things were before. So data and data scientists and how do you think about, because it's still development. And so it's still a developer experience, even though this audience might not think of themselves that way.
Yeah, totally. It's no, I wouldn't consider it a fast step at all. It's all the same problems, but it's just kind of different problems, which is interesting. Machine learning is fascinating because it's just this kind of completely. I'm thinking a lot here about deep learning, where we're dealing with these very large models that can do very complex things. It's almost like a completely different way of building software, where instead of us, the human, writing code to tell the computer what to do, we feed the computer lots of examples of how it should behave, and it just kind of figures it out. And in some sense, the programmers are becoming these people who create these training data sets, not the people who actually write code anymore, and all these kind of things, which is really interesting. But it's all metaphors and all analogies for all kind of the same things. And one of the problems we've encountered is these kind of two, again, coming back to who are the people and who are using these tools. There are two kind of sets of people in these machine learning world. There are the kind of or the people who are interacting with the software itself. These people who are like maybe researchers or data scientists. They're not really software engineers, like they're not very good at programming and that kind of thing. But they might have a PhD, for example, and they're extremely good at their particular domain. And then there are kind of more traditional software engineers who want to use all this clever machine learning stuff, but don't have a PhD and don't know math, but just know how to use an API and want to interact at that layer. So we're kind of building tools for those people to interact. And on the data scientist side, I think what's funny is that both these people know that the solution here is Docker, but the tools aren't available to use Docker as this interchange format. In the same way that Docker was the kind of interchange format between developers and ops. I think it's very similar in the data science world, where it's the interchange between kind of researchers and data scientists and engineering. So on the researcher side, what we found is that they know they want to use Docker, but it's just really hard for them to use. It's really hard to write a Docker file. Even for software engineers, it's really hard to get your Docker file right, you know. So we're building kind of abstractions around that to make that much easier to use. And then making these kind of interface layers, these sort of API layers as well, so these sort of teams can interact. And it's all, what's interesting is a very similar shaped problem to Docker, but just translated to a different world and a different handoff.
Yeah. We saw that in Docker too, right? The feedback of like, well, Docker file, even though I think we at Docker thought it was really easy. One of the things that when I was selling Docker, one of those really difficult things is to remember that you might have been doing this for a while, but the people you're talking to haven't, and potentially maybe the thing that I saw is maybe they don't have as much Linux experience or like literal command line experience, and so the run steps in specific were really challenging for them because they knew what they wanted to do, they just didn't know how to do it right. I know I want a package, but I'm not familiar with Linux package managers. So I mean, I like maybe go quick around the horn for what we see in terms of the future of like making that part better. So I mean, one piece is just there is a big wealth of content out there, but then there's the traditional sort of like taking a dependency on somebody else kind of challenges that go with consuming other people's content versus building it yourselves. I'd love to hear more about, you know, I mean, Arnaud, I imagine even at your company, you're building on top of these things. So when you're building software to deliver a better work experience, what are you thinking about when you think of these things?
I'm not sure what to say on this. I'm not sure what to say on this. I feel that there's so much at our disposal right now, and I do realize that the bar is still pretty high. But when I look back, you know, like before Docker, let's say 2014, 2015, before Docker was immensely popular, like it's quite amazing what we're capable of doing right now. And I do agree that there's still a lot we can do to make it more approachable for everyone. But when you look at it, like you could literally build a company that is going to serve millions of users and not have any dedicated ops team. It's quite mind-blowing when you think about it. Like those were things that required before, like a whole army of ops capable of provisioning infra, configuring services and operating those services. So we made significant progress on this, but I agree that the bar is still too high. And as you said earlier, like we're talking developer experience, but there's not one profile of developers. There's data scientists, there's backend developers, there's front-end developers, there's people who are doing very complex things with Zapier and Airtable and whatever no-code tool exists today. And they are developers. Maybe they don't call themselves this, but they are developers. And there's probably going to be individual tools for them that tomorrow will make them even 10 times more productive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the other bit is just the collaboration bit, which I think Ben is, I mean, that's kind of the sharing of the models for you, but for other folks, it's, you know, I think within Gitpod, you can like snapshot your workspace to say like, hey, I hit this bug, or I have this design, like I'm using the design system and it doesn't work, and just snapshot it, quiesce it, and toss it over on a link, and then somebody spins it back up and says, oh yeah, you messed up this part, or no, there is the bug, I found it. Yeah, you got it. I think the collaboration bit is also sort of a next sort of frontier on, you know, making sure the developers have a better experience, because especially in the age of COVID and, you know, work from home and maybe not have that over the shoulder that we used to have, especially we're a remote company. I imagine some of you are as well. You know, that's a big part that we think about. So there's a question from the audience that was about WebAssembly. Do any of you feel like you want to just talk about the I don't want to say the far future, but definitely the sort of the bleeding edge of how folks are thinking about other ways to define work and then ship it around. Or is everyone here going like, oh man,
There's something I find really interesting about WebAssembly. It's not kind of, I don't know a huge amount about it. It's certainly not my area of expertise. But I feel like we keep on inventing this kind of this kind of universal sort of bytecode again and again and again and again, which is really, really interesting. This LLVM was the last thing probably. And what I find fascinating about this is it's such a kind of testament to developer experience and culture and tooling. Whereas I think WebAssembly is really caught on because it has this kind of, it comes with the like JavaScript, the JavaScript culture, the JavaScript tooling, NPM, all this kind of thing, where LLVM was very like sort of the people working on the kernel and people who write C and all this kind of thing. It's just interesting how that different culture, although it's kind of the same thing, it's just this different culture means it gets grabbed and used in a different way.
Well, are we all gonna eventually get to unikernel eventually? Someday? We're all just gonna compile down to an actual runnable thing that's standalone.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I'm no expert, but I guess like the big evolution from the past, few years is that applications are more and more just glue code between APIs and with some compute, which makes the WebAssembly use case more and more appealing, because at the end of the day we're doing it's the code is less similar to what we had before with traditional servers. We're just compiling APIs together. So I think it's becoming more and more viable to do that. But right now it's kind of limited in terms of use cases, but I'm pretty sure that's going to change in the future. So that's something to keep an eye on.
Yeah. All right. So to wrap up, I would like to do an around the horn with two questions. The first is, what was something that you were most proud of in your time at Docker? Something that you're either development or team or whatever. And then the second question is, what was one lesson that you learned at Docker that you are applying going forward? And I will go real quick because I had a chance to think about this, and I will give y'all a second to think about it while I tell my story. So the thing that I'm most proud about at Docker is working with the team when I was working with the clouds and working with the PM team, with Ben, working with engineering. I spent a lot of time in Paris and Cambridge, which was awesome. I spent a lot of time with folks on desktop and Compose, and got to really cut across both a business side and a developer side, which was really great. And then ship integrations for Amazon ECS and Azure ACI, and better support for Docker and Docker Compose in the Docker extension for VS Code, and actually see those things go live and ship those. So that's definitely working with that team and doing those things are one of the things I'm most proud of. And then the thing that I think I take forward the most is just how you can change people's lives in a positive way. One of the things that I like so much about Docker was, if you were having a bad day, you could go out with a Docker shirt in the beginning or even in the middle, and somebody would stop you and say like, do you work at Docker? Yeah, I love Docker. It's great. It's a fantastic thing. Thank you very much. And my favorite story from that was I was in the Dominican Republic, and I was in a tiny town in a tiny beach, and the bartender saw my Docker shirt and said, hey, do you work at Docker? Yeah, I do. I'm going to night school. I'm learning how to program. I use Docker. I don't think I would be able to do it without it. This is great. Thank you very much. And that was pretty awesome, because I was in this relatively small country in a relatively small town, and hopefully going to make this person's life a little bit better. And so I think that is one of the things that I think about is, having come out of a non-traditional background, Docker and the technologies that we're working on can make it easier for folks to get into this industry, to get a better job, to get a better life. And that's something that I'm very proud of doing and want to do a lot more in the future. So let's go to, we'll go the same direction we did at introduction. So Arnaud.
Yeah. So what I'm the most proud of from my time at Docker, I think, is the work we did with open source. I think on the community side of things, we were an extremely welcoming community. We had maintainers from all around the world and from a huge amount of different companies. Those were, for me, really the best days. Like working, people like to say like different company, same team. I really felt this for a while at Docker, and I think it was really really amazing. The lesson I'm taking forward and that I think inspires me most in my current role, it's you mentioned it earlier, but really what happens when you manage to bridge different groups that didn't necessarily used to work together. So Docker managed to do that between dev and ops. And when a technical solution starts having social impacts on the dynamics of teams and of companies, I think this is truly fascinating. This is precisely what I'm trying to reproduce, not between dev and ops this time, but within engineering teams and business teams within organizations. And yeah, this is for me what brings me the most joy, when people start to understand how the other side operates and starts building empathy for each other just through the introduction of a tool, which when you think about it, it's pretty amazing.
To me, the thing I'm the most proud of from my Docker days are actually the team. Like, it created this, lifelong connection. Even here, like, we have all Docker people, and there's always this special connection when you see someone, used to work at Docker. It's very different from any past experience ever. And I think we managed to create like this group of people that were actually pulled in. It was not, just a job. It was like, there was this strong belief of we created developer experience together, or at least, changed the way people think about that. And also, even in the recruiting side, engineering, like, since people were super excited to work on Docker, and people were doing that on their spare time, and so we managed to to get those people that actually were spending their nights and weekends working on Docker to work full time at the company on that. So yeah, that amazing team of very motivated people rowing in the same direction, and yeah, even today, like many years later, it feels it's still special. And I think the biggest lesson is the same one is about the team and the growing pains of scaling too fast and bringing in too many people at once. So yeah, to me, like, the team was like the thing I'm the most proud about, and also the thing the biggest lesson from the time. So it's kind of like a mixed bag at this point.
All right, Ben.
Yeah, mine's echoing a lot of themes here, actually, unintentionally. There was a lot of, I think the thing I was most proud of at Docker, I think it was partly the team we built there, but also partly, I think a lot of what my job involved was being this kind of, as the team was scaling and growing really fast, being this kind of butterfly in the company, sort of going, oh, what are you doing over there, marketing team? What are you doing over there, sales team? And trying to get them all connecting together and doing things like, I remember sitting down with people on the sales team and helping them install Docker and helping them understand what this thing is and all this kind of thing, which was just really, I don't know, selfishly really fun, but also just helped bring the whole team together, I think, in a way that created this really kind of weird team we had, where it felt like an open source project, but it was a company, and that's and that was just really, really, I think, something quite unique we built there. And yeah, I think a lot of the lessons, those kind of lessons, I'm certainly taking to what I'm doing now. Certainly about how to build a team. I think a lot of things lot of things we learned, I think similarly to scaling a team, a lot of things we learned the hard way at Docker about how to build a business around open source and all this kind of thing, which taking a lot of those lessons to what I'm doing now, which is
yeah.
Well,
so as somebody who was on the sales team, I definitely appreciated it. I think that's another thing that I think that I'm trying to do here is it takes an entire company to actually make something successful. Like you have to have really great marketing and Ashlyn and Betty and Suzanne and David and so many people and sales and all the different and G&A and all the people that are in the back office just keeping the machine running. So yeah, really great. Now we'll have to go say hi to all the people that are in our heads, and hopefully I will see you all sometime in person soon. But thank you so much for coming and joining and spending some time with us today. We will have the socials for all these folks. We will have links to their companies and links to all the things we talked about in the YouTube. So if you're interested, just go to YouTube when these get posted. You can go see all those links. And then if you have questions, you can always just tweet at us and we'll try to answer some of your questions. Since sometimes it's really tough to do a live question and answer in a virtual panel. But I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we will see you all later.